Marxism is at a turning point in China. That's my impression. Thanks, Professor Hill, for inviting me. Thanks to you for coming. Welcome to all of you students, I think members of the embassy as well. So thank you for being here. I want to try to defend this hypothesis. Chinese Marxist philosophy is at some kind of turning point. And in order to understand that, I think we first have to look back. Where is Chinese Marxist philosophy, contemporary philosophy, coming from? What is the history? And this will be my first step. How do I change slides? Like that? Right.
Yes, like that.
So the first step will be to explain to you the history of Chinese Marxist philosophy. Where is it actually coming from? I will then try to map out the field a bit. What are the main debates? Who are the main protagonists? What are the questions people are talking about? And in the very final step, I will try to raise this question, in what sense is Marxist philosophy in China at a turning point? And what is the potential development here? Before we dive into that, I have a first section which I call method, or what and how. So what actually is Chinese Marxist philosophy? In what way do I use that term? This is the hypothesis I want to defend today. Marxist philosophy in China has been serving the aim of national emancipation, and the possible turning point at the moment is to go in its emancipation ambition to go beyond China. And as I will argue, this is actually, in its own self-understanding, hence from a Marxist point of view, necessary in order to even achieve the emancipation of itself. We'll come to that. So I will start with my first part. What do I mean when I say Marxist philosophy in China? Now, as far as I understand, Marxist philosophy of China in China can be described as one element within Chinese socialism, or socialism with Chinese characteristics. That's an official term that's being used in official documents. As far as I understand, it's being used on three levels. The first one is political practice, the second one is official ideology, and the third one is called, in Chinese, 马克思主义哲学基本原理. 马克思主义哲学基本原理. So the basic theories, the basic principles of Marxist theory. And that's the level I'm working on. So I'm not going to talk about political practice, at least not primarily. I'm not going to talk about official ideology, at least not primarily. But what I'm trying to do is, what is this project of theory building that is the bottom layer, the foundational level of socialism with Chinese characteristics? So what I'm presenting to you today is basically a philosophical debate, a philosophical discourse. And of course, it's in relation with the other two levels. We'll come to that. I'm looking at the period between 2012 and now for different reasons. One is, obviously, from a political point of view, this is the point where the leader of China at the moment took office. So in some way, it's a remarkable point. And from a second perspective, as you know, in the history part, I will explain a bit about the development of Marxist philosophy. I think from within the story of development of Marxist philosophy, we can see a break in 2012. That is not in itself already related to politics, but there's something like a new quality of research starting in 2012. We'll come to that. And there's one last reason. In the language that is being used to describe themselves, Chinese Marxists, for the time that starts in 2012, use a new term. I will use the Chinese word first and then translate it. The word that is used for Marxist philosophy until 2012 is usually called 马克思主义的中国化. So the sinicization of Marxism. And this changed. Now people are talking about 中国马克思主义哲学. So sinicized Marxist philosophy. The claim that's being transported by this terminological change is that Chinese Marxism is sinicized already. And this starts in 2012. So in a certain way, 2012 is, in the own self-description of Chinese Marxists, the beginning of what we now call Chinese sinicized Marxism. Now, regarding the color or quality of Marxist philosophy, I'm looking at what I call orthodox Marxist philosophy. Hence, Marxist philosophy that is in line with official positions in China. You will find other Marxisms in China, what we might call heterodox Marxisms. And paradoxically, if you look at Western language publications of Chinese Marxists, you will find that mainly heterodox Marxism is translated into, for example, English. Maybe because there is a need in the Western world to understand that there is a diversity of opinions in China for whatever reasons. But orthodox Marxist positions that are really in line with the official opinion, there's basically nothing translated, as far as I know, into Western languages. But this is what I'm interested in. So we'll talk about orthodox Marxism. Now, my main source is, we'll come back to that in a second, but my main source is, to put it very briefly, academic journal articles. So I'm not looking at monographs. The reason for that is that in the Chinese academic system at the moment, there's high pressure for qualification, and the main outlet for publications is journal articles, much more than monographs. That's a different, maybe a difference to at least the German-speaking academic world. I'm looking at mainland China in order to make sure it's what I call orthodox Marxist positions. And I have a philosophical focus, even when talking about subjects that might be approachable from an economic perspective or political perspective. So this is what I call Chinese Marxist philosophy. Now, there's a huge question here. How do we research about that regarding this huge amount of sources? So these are my own estimations. I looked at the structure of institutions in China. As far as I can see, there's mainly two institutions that work on Chinese Marxist philosophy. One is philosophical institutions, so philosophical faculties, and they usually have one branch of Marxist philosophy within that faculty. Since 2000, if I remember correctly, since 2017, every university, no matter what they're specializing on, is required to have a school of Marxism. So, and that's apart from School of Philosophy. And of course, they have teachers and students at School of Marxism as well. Hence, this creates a huge amount of professors and students of Marxist theory, Marxist philosophical theory. You can see the numbers I came up with, roughly counting. 5,000 professors. And as far as I can see, they publish 30,000 articles per year. So how to research that? I have some criteria to choose my articles. In the question and answer section, if you want to, I can make that transparent, but I have certain criteria how to choose representative articles. But I think even more interesting question is, how do we identify the main topics, the main debates? And the methodological, I call it seismographical tool I use to identify major topics is the following. I look at amendments to, in my opinion, the most authoritative document of the Chinese political societal system. And that is the statute or constitution of the Communist Party of China. As far as I can see, it's even more authoritative than the constitution of the PRC itself. And it's more sensitive to changes in trends of thought. This constitution of the Communist Party is amended every 5 years at the National Congress of the Communist Party. And I look at how this constitution of the party has been changed in recent periods. And that's how I identify main topics. Now, the format is a bit messed up, but when looking at the key concepts that appear in these amendments, I can somehow detect that there's a reciprocal influence between academic work on Chinese Marxism and these ideological documents. I identified something like 7 periods. This is true for all the major topics and major keywords that I'm going to talk about in a minute. So there's a certain sequence how these key concepts emerge. And the first phase is that in academic works, they start to somehow explore a topic. I call this the period of exploration. It doesn't have a keyword yet, but some people are thinking about something. One example I'm going to talk about a lot today is the so-called second integration, 第二个结合. 第二个结合, there's a first integration, but the second integration is really a hot topic at the moment. And the basic idea is that Marxist principles can be integrated with Chinese tradition and traditional thought. So this idea is not new at all. Among academic scholars, it appeared a long time ago. So that's what I call a period of exploration. And then in some documents, rather low-level documents, speeches, so not the constitution of the party yet, but in some speeches, this idea will be raised. And this provides justification to scholars to further explore the topic. Then we move into the third phase. Scholars take it up again because they feel justified in doing so and deepen the ideas. This goes back again to ideological level, and something happens which I call branding. So in ideological texts, this topic gets a keyword, like the one I just mentioned, second integration. Usually that keyword, that brand for a topic, doesn't appear in academic texts. It's just given by ideological texts, by official texts. Then this goes back again to the academic field. They operate with the concept, apply it to different regions, to different areas. And if this concept proves to be useful and meaningful, something happens which I call canonization. So it's being inscribed into the most authoritative documents. And then a new phase of academic work starts, which gives again the floor to new explorations and new topics. Now, I talked about this a bit at length because I think there are two conclusions which are worth noting. The first one is that the influence between the academic world in China and the ideological levels is reciprocal. Usually, our intuition would be that ideological authorities would give ideas to the academic level and they would just have to carry out. There are models like that. Ryan Dunge, I don't know whether you have heard of him, a cover code model. The basic idea is that ideology provides a code, wordings, and academic works imitate it and use it as cover. So that's a one-way street. But in Chinese Marxism, we see that it's reciprocal. So in the building of ideology, they use academic texts to get ideas. And I think that's hugely important because, that's the second conclusion here, there is at least a partial independence of scholarly Marxist work in China. I think it's very important to acknowledge that. I'm very happy that Helena Xiam is here today. You have a lot of experience in teaching in China, and you know that scholars of Marxism in China, they're highly professional. Most of them learn German in order to read the texts. So it's far away from just being influenced by or repeating ideological content. There's real scholarly work being done in Chinese Marxist philosophy, and that's important to acknowledge. It's rarely acknowledged, as far as I know, in the West. So this is how I identify topics. To make it short, I mainly looked at the amendments that were made last National Congress, the famous 20th, 20大, the 20th National Congress. If you counted, 50 amendments were made. Then there are documents that justify these amendments, so party documents that give reasons. If you use those documents, you can figure out there's something like 10 topics. Clustering these topics, I come up with 3 main debates. And the 3 main debates are these. The second integration, I just used that as an example for describing the reciprocal influence of academia and ideology. The second one is socialist market economy. I think a topic that is extremely relevant for outsiders looking at Chinese Marxism, because from an economic point of view, they would judge where is socialism in China if there's market economy. But of course, there's a debate about that in China. And the third one is a deeply political debate. It's about the founding mission and the original aspiration of the Communist Party of China and the socialist project in China. So these are the 3 debates I'm going to touch on today. I'm mainly going to touch on the first one, culture. If there's time enough, or if there's someone interested, we can go deeper into the other ones. Before I start, and before I make my point, I try to give you something like a short history of Marxist philosophy in China, a very short one. Why am I doing that? First of all, I think we can understand the quality of contemporary Marxism much better if we understand where it came from. The second one is, my main thesis, I think, will be much more clear if we understand how this developed. So remember, my main thesis is that at the moment, Marxist philosophy in China serves the ambition of national self-emancipation. And there's a turning point, and there is theoretical potential present in Chinese Marxist philosophy. There's a turning point to go beyond the Chinese nation in the ambition of emancipating whom? We'll see. That's my main point. Now, if you look at the history of Chinese Marxist philosophy in China, we'll see where that national ambition comes from and why maybe there might be a change now. There's literature about history of Marxist philosophy in China, English-speaking literature. It usually goes up to 1978. That's when economically and politically there was something that we call reform and opening up. Usually after 78, people in the West stopped researching Chinese Marxism, mainly because there was the opinion that with the introduction of some kind of market economy, there is no socialism in China anymore. So we don't have to take Marxism in China serious. So there's almost no Western literature on Chinese Marxist philosophy for the period after 78. What I'm doing is I'm looking at how Chinese Marxist philosophers read Marxist primary texts, and that's how I structure my history. Reading Marxist primary texts, of course, is only one part of Marxist philosophy, right? It's probably the most fundamental, but it's just one part. Usually in Chinese Marxists themselves, they usually differentiate between three levels of Marxist reflection. One would be wenbenxue, wenben yanjiu. So working, that's what I'm doing here, working on Marxist primary texts. Then there's wenxian yanjiu, that's working on the context, historical context, philosophical context of Marx and his time and his work. And then there is 中国化研究, Sinicization, research on Sinicization. And that's much more applied to a contemporary world. So that's the three levels. I'm looking at the first one. And I want to suggest to identify 5 periods, 5 phases in the development of how Chinese Marxists looked at Marxist primary texts. The first period is what I call a period of orientation. And it's a move, I'm sorry for these blunt slogans, of course, it's not that black and white. There's much more variety and it's much more complicated, but it just brought it down to a few slogans. There's a movement that we could call from a mix of ideas, a mix of inputs of modernity towards the idea that Marx had. In this period, there is something like 2 groups of people interested in Marx. The first group is intellectuals. They had an interest in cultural reform. They were mainly influenced by Japan. Their knowledge of Marxist texts mainly came through Japan. They themselves spent time in Japan reading work, and they did translations from Japanese Marx text to Chinese. So that's the first group. And we can see that in their idea of Marx, they're highly influenced by international revolution. So the early translators of Marxist texts into Chinese, they belong to what we would call a Trotskyian movement. So a branch of Marxism that believes that a socialist revolution aims at an international collaboration and not at establishing a socialist system in one country. So that's one group. And there's a second group, and that group is mainly influenced by the Soviet Union. They're mainly seeking for some kind of institutionalization, which is the Communist Party of China. They develop out of that first circle of intellectuals, cultural reformers, and their idea of reform is not just cultural, it's very political and very institutionalized. And their aim is, through a political party, to create a socialist country. And of course, the movement of Communist Party of China belongs to that second group. And its most representative persons in that period before 49, Mao Zedong, on first place, they belong to that second group. What I want to point out to you here is that there was a choice. A choice was made. And the group of people who were using Marx for cultural purposes, trying to move towards an international socialist revolution, this group was not the group that was the mainstream, but the mainstream was the group that was in contact with Soviet Union and tried to build up a party and create a socialist nation. That's the group that in 49 formally won the battle of who's reading Marx. So in 49, the PRC was founded, and that's the manifestation, the official manifestation of the victory of that first group. But there was a choice. The other people, so the translators who translated from Japanese, wanted cultural movement, international ambitions, most of them did not stay in China. They went to Hong Kong, they went to Macau, they emigrated to Europe, wherever, but they didn't stay in China. And this, of course, is also complicated because some very important people who were part of the early movement of introducing Marx to China belonged actually to that first group and were not able to stay in China all along towards 49. For example, some of you might know these names, Chen Duxiu. These people at some point in their ideas diverted from the Communist Party of China. Okay, so that's the first period. China is in the process of seeking modernity. It needs new culture. And there's two groups of people introducing Marx. And in 49, Marx officially becomes what in Chinese is called 指导思想, so the guiding idea. And then we move into a second period. I call it from Marx to Marxism in singular, or a period of standardization. This period is mainly influenced by Soviet interpretations of Marx and Marxist texts. Now, standardization happens on many levels. Before 49, actually a lot of Marxist texts are being translated into Chinese. But after 49, especially in the 50s, middle of 50s, in China they start to have the idea of establishing collected works of Marx. So that's a unified edition of Marx's work with unified terminology, published at the same place, published by the same publishing house, and so on. So there's a standardization of the language that's being used to transport Marx's ideas, which is hugely important if it's a guiding principle. I mean, if it's a politically guiding principle, you have to express these ideas in a unified language. There's standardization also on other levels. I'm going to raise two more. The first is the form in which Marxist principles were transmitted. The second one is the content. Regarding form, there was a certain genre of Marx philosophical texts. That's the textbook. And Chinese Marxists, looking back at that period, they even called it textbook Marxism. So the basic idea is, at that time, Marxist ideas, people did not necessarily read the primary texts, but the ideas were promulgated in textbooks. So there was an idea of standardization of the material that is being used to transport Marx's ideas. And second, content. Scholars in China introduced paradigms of Marxism. And these paradigms in the beginning were learned from the Soviet Union. So the first paradigm, the two first paradigms they used was, you all know them, dialectical materialism and historical materialism. These were the two paradigms. And all of Marx's texts were used to be put in line with those two paradigms. We'll see later how these paradigms are used nowadays. Then in 1978, a new quality on all levels of Chinese society suddenly comes up. There's an opening up, a reform. It happens economically, it happens politically, it also happens intellectually, and it also happens in the reception of Marxist texts. After 78, people start to get away from the Soviet interpretations and they start to reintegrate new influences. There's mainly two influences they integrate. The first one is Japan again. So they get back to Japan, which was irrelevant after 49 because that group that was close to Japan had lost that battle for authority in reading Marx. So they were influenced again by Japan, and that's when a new paradigm was introduced, a paradigm that was explicitly not influenced by Soviet Marxism, and that's practical materialism. Some people, Helena, you might know much more about this, but some Marxists in the West regard this idea of practical materialism as an idea that is originally Chinese in some way, as a new principle next to dialectical materialism and historical materialism. So there's diversification on all levels, a new paradigm. What becomes important as second source of influence is Anglo-Saxon Marxism. And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first one is, other than some branches of German-speaking or Eastern European Marxism, they didn't try to provide a competing ideology, which of course some schools of Marxism in the West did. But the Anglo-Saxon Marxists provided historical studies on Marx, Marxist texts. And that's what Chinese researchers were looking for at that point of time. The second reason is that in Anglo-Saxon Marxism at that time, the so-called young Karl Marx was very important. So the young Karl Marx, today it's highly debated, is it even possible to make that distinction? But at that point of time, people thought of young Karl Marx as being much more philosophical than the later Marx, who reflected on politics and economics. Now, in the Soviet Union, young Karl Marx was not highly received because some of the ideas he transported in those early writings were in some way could have been interpreted as being in contrast to the actual circumstances in the Soviet Union. So by going back to the young Karl Marx, Chinese Marxists touched on something that Soviet Marxism had not touched upon. And this was highly attractive to them. It was a means of liberating themselves from the model of Soviet Marxism. In 2012, something new happens. You see that this fourth period is very short. And I think it's not even possible to call it a period or phase. It's a turning point, a turning moment. And in 2012, we can, at least in the texts I looked at, we can identify suddenly a new awareness of a problem in reading Marx. And that awareness is, look guys, we're all depending on external influences. We were depending on Japan and the Soviet Union. We were depending on Anglo-Saxon Marxism. Now let's go back to Marx and read the primary texts. That's a problem consciousness that rises around 2012. And I think it's extremely representative for many other intellectual political movements that happen at that time. So an awareness of independently, without external influences, looking at things. And Marxist texts are one of these things that Chinese people are looking at that point of time. So following that turning point, Chinese Marxists go in two directions. The first one is what I would call the historical Marx. So they suddenly start reading the texts themselves. They have done that before too, but with a new love for Marxist texts. And they read a lot of literature that is around Marx. Nowadays, talking to my co-students in Beijing, I noticed that they know usually much more about 19th century German philosophy than I had ever learned while studying in Germany. It's incredible what sources they dig out and what they translate and the knowledge they have of political movements at the time and texts surrounding Marx. So there's this movement of let's go back to historical Marx. And that's what happens in that period. And then there's a second movement that starts a bit later, and I call it a fifth period. The interest is not just anymore to go back to historical Marx, but let's use historical Marx in our understanding for the Chinese circumstances. So there's a movement from historical Marx to Sinicized Marx or Chinese Marxism. And there's a few characteristics of that period. This is the period I'm I picked 3 debates out, so we'll come to that. Just to give you a rough idea, what became important is 领域哲学. So in German we would call it Bereichsphilosophien, area philosophies, I guess would be the word in English. So Marx is not just being read in abstract terms or whatever, but we look at one certain area of political problems and we try to apply Marx's work to these very specific areas. For example, the relationship between government and society. That's a debate that's quite a hot debate at the moment. So area philosophies. And then there are a few principles of interpretation. So one is people-centeredness. For those of us who are acquainted with the Chinese language, this is a real buzzword. For others, it might sound just like an empty phrase, but that's an important hermeneutic principle in Marxism at the moment, people-centeredness. So let's look at the problems that arise from Chinese society and take these as the reading key for Marxist text, and not anymore historical circumstances. So the debates I'm going to talk about now, the 3 debates, they're all in this 5th period. What I wanted to show you with this historical overview is that there's a clear movement towards this turning point that I'm trying to describe to you. There's a clear movement of Chinese readings of Marx emancipating itself from external influences. I named many of them. And the target of that movement is we want Marx embedded in Chinese intellectual life and Chinese politics and society. That's the Marx we're aiming at. And the Germans, with their understanding of Marx and so on, their understanding is different and they don't have to teach us how we understand Marx. We can, of course, learn from each other, but we have a Chinese understanding of Marx. And in some way, I think the turning point we're at would have to be at number 6 here, but we'll come to that. Remember, these are the 3 debates. I'm looking at the time just to see how much time have I got. I think I'm going to just start with the first one, and then we'll see how it goes on. Remember, I identified topics by looking at amendments to the constitution of the Communist Party of China. And this is just one of these amendments, one of those 50 amendments in one of those 10 groups of amendments. And this is the amendment where that keyword, 两个结合, 2 integrations, and the second integration appears. And I try to sum up for you now a bit what Marxist philosophers, what do they deal with when they deal with that. At first sight, it sounds like, I don't know what your impression is, but it might sound like a crazy ambition. What does 5,000-year-old Chinese tradition have to do with Western 19th century systematic philosophy? It might sound a bit crazy, or it might sound too ideological. This is just, a political program and so on. So I want to challenge that view a bit by presenting you the very, very, very complicated and intense work that Marxist philosophers are doing on that question. My first point is I try to make you aware of the question they're discussing. So the question is not, from a systematic point of view, a philosophical systematic point of view, a comparative philosophical point of view, where are the connections between traditional ideas in China and Marxist ideas in China? That's not the main question. But the main question is, what does, under the condition that this integration of those 2 systems exists, what has it historically produced? That's the main question. Now, going back, this is not a new topic at all. The relation between Chinese tradition and Marxism had been talked about, I think, with the very first moment when Marx was introduced to China. As early as 1877, Marx still being alive, we have first books on the question of socialism being somehow identical with Moritz. So this started during the lifetime of Marx. Of course, the socialism at that time was not necessarily the socialism of Marx, but it started very early. At the end of 19th century, a lot of Chinese intellectuals asked themselves that question. And we can sum up a few steps in that process. So in the very early time, they had the feeling intuitively that Marxism has to do with some things in Chinese tradition. But then the new culture movement started, 1917, 1919, after World War I. And there was this movement of let's leave Chinese tradition behind and take a new path towards modernity. Under those circumstances, people were not willing to connect Marxism with Chinese tradition because they were looking for something new. So this topic somehow disappeared. In the 20s, it came back. Some of you might know the name Guo Moruo. He was a historian, mainly a historian. He had the idea that Marx's perspective of history can be used to analyze and categorize Chinese history. So they used Marx's stages of development of society to categorize Chinese tradition, and they would look at the Book of Changes and say that reflects a feudalist society or whatever. So in that time, we can see that Chinese tradition is clearly subordinate to Marxism. We use Marxism to understand Chinese tradition. Then in the turmoils of 49, the discussion disappears again. In the 60s, it's being taken up again, but still in a very asymmetrical way. People discuss whether Chinese tradition had a form of dialectics that is identifiable with the dialectics in Marx. And there was huge debates. What they came up with as solution was a distinction between 朴素辩证法, something like a common dialectics that is not a very developed form of dialectics, but a common one that is a bit similar to Marx, but not completely. So it's still judging tradition by Marx's benchmark. It's still subordinate. In the 60s, 70s, Cultural Revolution, of course, the discussion disappears again. In the 80s, it comes back. And in the 80s, people feel that after Cultural Revolution and the end to it, there's a new legitimacy of going back to Chinese tradition. And in a very free way, they re-research Chinese tradition. People like Zhu Bokun, maybe some of you have heard of him, he went back to Chinese tradition. He's just one example, but he went back and from ideas that he took from Marx, tried to develop them in the Chinese context. So suddenly it's on eye level. That's a huge change. What we have now is not just eye level, but we have two things for the first time. First one is it's an official project. Never before had the integration of tradition and Marxism been officially ratified or justified. Now it's official. That changes the whole tone of discussion. And the second new thing is that we're not talking anymore about comparison. Take this thought in Book of Changes and this thought in Marx. Oh, isn't it similar? We're not talking about this anymore. This is taken as a presupposition. It's just taken as foundation. We're now talking about what does that integration bring about. And the main idea is a new form of modernity. Chinese modernity is a huge topic at the moment in debates in China. All over the place, but especially in Chinese Marxism. And the idea is that China is longing for a form of modernity that is not the same as the Western one. And that also means not the same as the capitalist one, but a new form of modernity. And the two main sources to create that new form of modernity is Marxism on the one hand and Chinese tradition on the other hand. Now, I'm going to present to you two things. The first one is, after looking at a lot of literature on this topic, I think all these thinkers, they have four main thoughts in common. I'm going to present those. And then I'm going to look at one thinker in particular, and because we can see what is at stake in that discussion. I think it's not a simple discussion. There's a lot, at least in the self-understanding of Chinese Marxists, there's a lot at stake here. So 4 theses, I'm going to keep this very short. The first thesis that basically all scholars agree upon is that Chinese Marxism and tradition were integrated on a practical level way before people started theorizing about it. So what we're doing now is through theory, retroactively understanding how in the practice of Chinese socialism, these two were always integrated. The second thing is the topic of agency. By proclaiming the integration that already happened, China is proclaiming too that it is the creator of its own modernity. And this is quite important because there is this idea that China had a passive modernization, modernized by the West or modernized by China, by Japan. But the idea here is we're the agents of our own modernity. And it was not Marxism that just was implanted into China, but Chinese tradition provided the soil for Marxism to grow. So it really is about agency, and that's a new change of historical perspective for Chinese historians. With a lot of potential, by the way, just in brackets. We're moving away from an at least partial victimization of self-victimization of modernity. So there's a new perspective on the Opium Wars, there's a new perspective on the influence of the West, simply by being aware of the fact that all along there was an agency in Chinese tradition. And modernity was not that influenced by the West as people think. That's the self-understanding. Third thesis, equivalence, 契合性. So the agency is 主体性. This one is 契合性. The idea is that as a presupposition of researching about this topic, Chinese tradition and Marxism in relevant aspects are just equivalent. Have same ideas. And the fourth one is efficiency, or we could call it historical effectiveness. So this integration is changing history. Now I have 5, I call this gravitational fields. We could also say what's at stake in that discussion. I've raised some things. I'm just going to try to sum it up again. The first one is China's integrity. The historical perspective on China's modernization usually names 2 conflicts or two splits. 中西古今之战. So there's a conflict between China and the West, and there's a conflict between tradition and innovation or modernity. And the idea of the second integration is that just like an intersection point, it can overcome these conflicts. Marx is an idea that originates in the West, but it was Sinicized, so it's a bridge to overcome the split between West and China. Marx is an innovative idea in modernity, but it's equivalent to ideas that were present in Chinese tradition. So it can overcome the split between tradition and modernity. So somehow Marx is the cornerstone of a building, and these separations and splits, they somehow reunite in the Sinicization of Marx. And the idea in Chinese Marxism is that this is actually a topic for everyone in modernity, not just for China. And there might be something that's true about that. In Western modernity, I think possibly ever since Enlightenment, there's many elements of Western tradition that we are not yet able to integrate with modern tendencies. So maybe there's something interesting about that idea. National agency, I've talked about that. Alternative modernity, I think we've said enough about that. Chinese modernity that's not capitalist, but socialist, that's not Western, but authentically connected to the local culture. And China understands itself as representative for other countries here. The fourth point, if you're interested, we can talk about it more. This might be the most fundamental thing. There is the idea that in order to achieve a new form of modernity, China is reconnecting to its autonomous form of rationality. A rationality that is not the rationality of the West. And there's the idea of really going back to the deepest layers of culture in China. And practice and thought, we've talked about this. Okay, so second integration, what I basically wanted to show you is there's a lot at stake here. It's for Chinese Marxists, it's far away from an only ideological discourse, but what's reflected in this discourse is a movement of emancipating China in its integrity, the Chinese civilization. These two I'm going to skip. If there are questions, we can go back to them. The second debate is on the economic system, socialist market economy. How is that justified? How do people talk about it? If you're interested, we can go back to it. And this is the longest text part that was newly introduced to the constitution of the Communist Party. It's basically the political foundational idea of how socialism works as political system. Now I'm trying to sum up my thesis. I suppose you could guess from what I said, or you could get a feeling for why do I think there is an ambition of national self-emancipation, and why Marxism in China is mainly a project of emancipating China. If we look at Marx, and in my thesis, I try to develop Marx's notion of emancipation as a benchmark to measure Chinese emancipation. There's an interesting thought in Marx. For Marx, emancipation is always reflexive. So there's a particular subject that emancipates itself. For Marx, in the beginning, of course, there's some changes in his ideas, but there's a particular subject that emancipates itself. Mainly it's the proletarian class emancipating itself against other classes within the nation. But the aim of this particular emancipation is never that it emancipates only itself, but this particular subject causes a general emancipation. The idea is not that the proletarian class becomes the new ruling class, but the idea is that through the particular self-emancipation of a specific subject, the emancipation of the general object of all can be achieved. If we take that as benchmark for measuring Chinese Marxism, you get the question. I mean, China is very strong in stressing itself as particular subject of its own emancipation. So China is emancipating itself. But can it achieve more than just self-emancipation? And here I'm posing that question just on a theoretical level. So my question is, how do Chinese Marxists think about that question? Is it possible for Chinese Marxists to think about more than national self-emancipation? Emancipation of humankind, or an emancipation of the whole world, or whatever you want to call that ambition of Marx. And my thesis is that in Chinese Marxism, it's been 2 years, something like that, there is a new term that is being discussed, and it has at least the theoretical potential to provide a ground for reflection on an emancipation that goes beyond its particular subject towards a general object. And that's the term civilization. It's a central term at the moment, but this idea arises. So China, through its self-emancipation, contributes to a civilizational emancipation that goes far beyond China, but touches upon the relationship between civilizations. So the potential is there. And hence my conclusion, Chinese Marxism can fulfill its ambitions of national self-emancipation only if it provides theoretical resources that transcend the Chinese nation. The current conceptualization of civilization entails this potential. I'm going to stop here. As an appendix, we might come back to some other implications. But let's see where your questions take us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Moritz, for this extremely this I found extremely interesting and rich thought that in some cases, opened my eyes to things I had never thought of before, and in other cases gave maybe a theoretical vocabulary to observations that I had noticed myself in my time in China. I'm going to use my prerogative with one question to